One, two, three. Hey, everybody, welcome back. Chalkboard History, more Crash Course in the 160th sphere. So, gosh, is this like the fourth video we've shot? I feel my energy beginning to be sapped.
I think this is the fourth.
You know what, though? This one's going to be fun because this is about federal troops.
The 4th and 23rd Corps.
From the 4th and 23rd Corps. So a little bit of the Army of the Cumberland, old-timey guys.
Oh, our chalkboard just broke.
Oh, my goodness.
Look at that.
Well, you know, made in China.
There it is, anyhow.
23rd Corps, element. Was there anything else other than the 23rd Corps and the Army of the Ohio in 1864, or was that it?
That's it.
And then a little bit of some sprinkling of new guys who get dropped into the 23rd Corps, but also there's some draftees and conscripts in the 4th Corps. So who are these men?
Well, a lot like we talked about in the Army of Tennessee video, born 1840 on, 1830 on. A lot of guys, particularly in the 4th Corps, Midwesterners. You're looking at Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, the heartland soldiers.
Lots of farmers.
A lot of veterans.
A lot of guys who'd use their own two white hands.
Yes, and
a lot of Republicans.
And a lot of kind of self-determined. A lot of self-determination, self-reliance.
Immigrants.
A lot, particularly in the 23rd Corps.
And a lot of sons of immigrants. Yes. So really you have your first-generation Americans.
Yeah. And they're
USA,
hardened Midwesterners.
Early versions of that.
They almost always get described.
Right.
But veterans of the war, particularly in the 4th Corps, Army of the Cumberland, lot of veterans.
Shiloh.
They start out there, Thomas John Wood and David Stanley, and these are the names that keep coming up.
George Wagner.
Yeah. And then we get to the 23rd Corps, essentially raised in 63, thrown into Atlanta, under the command of General John Schofield.
At Knoxville.
Yep.
Don't forget about Knoxville in 63.
Yep. Knocked around a fair bit there.
Fighting James Longstreet.
Yep. And then Burnside's gone. Schofield's in. Army goes down to Atlanta, fights with Sherman. They're the flanking corps because they're the smallest. They can move the fastest, all those things. They really prove themselves in the Atlanta campaign.
So let's dig into something we hear all the time. Well, they weren't abolitionists. They were only fighting to preserve the Union.
Not all of them.
He didn't care about slavery. He only cared about preserving the Union.
Well, there are certainly a lot of guys that are Union men. That's why they join up in 61. But we've talked about this before. It changes. People's minds can change. You can evolve to new thoughts.
And they also can adjust to the fact that the war itself changed, and it didn't really matter what they thought by 63. But many of them did begin to change. And I, a number of years ago, read a dissertation, and I can't remember the name of the fellow who put it together, but he studied the letters of a handful of Illinois soldiers, many of them who were in the 4th Corps, and how they viewed emancipation. And it's remarkable in about a 6 to 9 month stretch how these men who use some of the, it's just most outrageous, like racial pejoratives imaginable. Everything from the discussions about black people's mannerisms to their hair and, all of this stuff you'd see. I mean, basically Sambo descriptions. And a lot of these guys had never seen black people. But over time, you begin to see how, as they watched women and children, especially, and how they watched women and children often escaping scenes of war and destruction, you begin to see they, grudgingly in some cases, begin to see that they are people too. They're not what they thought they were. And, immense change like that has to start somewhere, and it usually starts slowly. And I remember reading it thinking, wow, how did that guy go from how we viewed emancipation in March and April? And some of them downright angry at Lincoln. But then they got on these battlefields and they realized they were still fighting rebels. and insurrectionists, or traitors as they called them, and were committed to saving the Union. But they now knew they were also fighting to end slavery, that this was not the condition that people should be forced to live in. And I think that that is extraordinarily key, especially as you get into 1864, when you see there's a draft. Obviously, there are Northern men being drafted, but there are tens of thousands of Northern men who are enlisting, volunteering. Some are young, had just turned 17 or 18. Some were in their mid to late 30s and were enlisting to avoid the draft. But they were still volunteering. And this hodgepodge, I think when you look at Southern soldiers, they often come from really a couple of different camps. Slave owners, not slave owners. Wealthy, poor. Northerners come from a very broad spectrum. Even today, a lot of people are like, well, the Yankees all came from cities. I'm like, have you ever been to Illinois?
Yeah.
Like,
or Ohio,
most of it's rural to
cities.
this day. And I think part of the thing when it comes to slavery and race is a lot of these guys, I pointed out earlier, working with their own two white hands. They'd been out there working fields, cutting down trees, milking cows, doing all the fun stuff that happens in a farm. Slavery was almost anathema to their daily existence. Now, they still have a huge racial barrier they have to climb over. But the war has a fundamental shift. And I think he also is pushing the country to the edge, saying, if we don't end this now through the war, and this is my biggest point.
Never have a chance.
If we don't stop this, if we don't end this, if we don't crush this into oblivion, we could win this and be right back where we started. So, Southerners, we're going to end slavery, and Northerners, you're going to have to suck it up and learn to think that black people are equal to you. And it's not probably going to happen right now. But it's going to happen over years. It's going to happen. There are millions of people who aren't even yet born, who are going to grow up in a, this is a sort of modern term, but like a post-racial society. That is not something that was a foreign concept to these Northerners, because they, especially if you'd never seen black people and you saw how absolutely horrible slavery was, and you saw people crawling across the landscape just to be free, that begins to have an impact.
Well, it's the Frederick Douglass quote, right? Is there is no war for the Union without a war to end slavery. There is no war to end slavery without a war to save the Union.
That's right. And I think that what we often do is we get into this thing about, well, it's all good people and bad people. That's not the case. What happens is one side does begin to evolve. Slowly, glacially, as black men are being enlisted into the U.S. Army and U.S. Navy, but the other side is not. In fact, the other side is doubling down in many ways. That they're right, that we're never going to arm black men, that we will rather be destroyed, vanquished, conquered, than ever give up our slaves.
And I think just by looking at just these two individual formations, the 4th Corps and the 23rd Corps, they give us perfect opportunities to talk about that difference in the men. Who's the guy in the 4th Corps? George Wagner. Wagner's a Union man. I mean, so far as we can tell, all the things that are out there, he never really mentions a whole lot about emancipation, never really talks a whole lot about slavery. But when he's in the State House in Indiana, what's he talking about in 1861? Treason, insurrection, rebellion, got to go off, got to save the Union. In the 23rd Corps, though, Jacob Cox. Abolitionist.
Oberlin
Emerson
College.
Opdyke.
Abolitionist.
Isaac Sherwood. Abolitionist. And there's a difference between the men, but they're also all fighting for the same reason.
And the evolution of this is seen in the presidential election of 1864. Because Lincoln won a divided kind of squeaker in 1860. It wasn't the case in 64, and he's running against McClellan. And so Northerners who were Democrats abandoned, Northern soldiers who were Democrats abandoned McClellan at about 3 or 4 times the rate that the public did, because they believed that what the commander-in-chief was doing was actually solving two problems.
I almost wonder what the Democratic, or excuse me, the political breakdown, the party alliance breakdown would be between the two corps. You think they'd be similar?
Probably. I don't think there would have been a huge difference.
Yeah.
Because Lincoln wins probably 80% of the soldiers' vote, and I don't think that was a lot different either in the Army of the Potomac or the Army of the Cumberland. Maybe there was a little more support in the Western armies like the Army of the Cumberland, but between these corps, I don't think there would have been a huge difference. But I know there's ample evidence that they saw this as solving two problems: end slavery, save the Union.
Yeah.
Those two are now connected, and then you get, as we ended our Confederate Army of Tennessee episode, you get to Franklin. Everybody knows what's at stake. Everybody. To think that the soldiers didn't know the world as it existed on November 30th, it is really sort of... I've always been puzzled by people who don't want to talk about that, because why wouldn't we? We knew the status of the world in the summer of 1944 when the great liberation of Europe was about to begin. The Civil War soldiers knew full well the status of things in November of 1864. It didn't matter what army you were in. But the guys on this side who won the war did end up with a different legacy. And I think maybe this is where to end. Their legacy, strangely enough, was to almost be forgotten.
That's the great point of Brian Jordan's book, Marching Home. These veterans, they go home and, all right, well, the Union's saved and slavery's over, and what do you have to show for it?
We remember Grant. We remember Sherman. We remember a few characters, especially out east. But for a lot of guys who went back to Illinois and Ohio and Indiana, yeah, they'd won the war. They went back to farm or work in a store or be a teacher or a cobbler or, some made barrels.
I almost wonder it's because they resumed the life that they had before, whereas in the South, the world was completely different.
The guys,
total social change.
The guys in the 183rd Ohio just went back to over the Rhine and went back to Cincinnati and, worked on the river, drank beer at night, went back to their wife, got married, had kids or whatever. But their legacy is something else too. And I think this is where, when we stretch Civil War to civil rights, people are like, you can't talk about that.
I like the burning sinews.
Right. I had holy water. Throw it. Many of these guys went back to the Midwest.
Yeah.
Right? Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Michigan, Illinois, on and on, Ohio. And basically anything west of Pennsylvania, north of the Ohio River. 100 years passed. And Mississippi and Selma, Alabama are on the map with civil rights. And once again, the eyes turn toward people from this part of the country. And you've heard me say that one of the things that Martin Luther King wanted to do was get on the television so people in the Northeast might have already been on board with civil rights, but he wanted to get into the hearts of these hardworking people in the Midwest and show them what was actually happening in Alabama. And a lot of them didn't. And they were the grandchildren and maybe great-grandchildren of the soldiers. It's the same thing. In 1861, a lot of the people from Lansing, Michigan, or Indianapolis, Indiana, they didn't know what was happening in the South. And when they saw it, they were emboldened to try and end it. And to make it, as Lincoln said, a more perfect union. And that's maybe the best way to finish. This isn't, these guys are so fantastic. But you know what? They did some pretty fantastic things. And I think they should at least get credit for that. They saved the United States of America from its domestic enemies. And they ended slavery.
And they went home and they got very little to show for it.
And you got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And they went home just like World War II vets went home, and they went back and for the most part lived lives of peace. Quiet peace. And tried to be good citizens. And I think that's a great legacy for those men as well. Last thoughts?
I think that nails it. Yeah.
All right, thanks everybody.